The loner cowboy waited for a common mail-order bride, but a woman too beautiful for him arrived. Ben Porter had lived most of his life alone, and he preferred it that way. His ranch, the Dusty Trail, sat on the edge of Cactus Ridge, a small town surrounded by endless stretches of dry, rocky desert. Ben was a cowboy through and through, strong, quiet, and independent. He had no time for the bustling life in town or the distractions of crowded saloons. Every day was the same for Ben. He woke before dawn to tend to his cattle, repaired fences, and worked the land. There was a simple peace in the routine of it all. But as the years passed, something inside him began to change. He was growing tired of the silence that filled his days. The long, lonely nights, with only the wind and the coyotes for company, started to wear on him. He had once been in love, young and full of hope, but that had ended in heartbreak. The woman he had fallen for left without a word, and since then, Ben kept to himself, never letting anyone get too close. The loneliness weighed heavily on him, even though he never spoke of it. His neighbors in Cactus Ridge knew him well enough to understand that Ben was not the type to show his emotions. He was a man of few words, but his heart was full of unspoken thoughts. One afternoon, as Ben sat on his porch, sipping a cup of black coffee, he heard the creak of the old wooden mailbox swinging in the wind. The letter inside was a sign, a message from the outside world, a world that had always felt so far away. With a sigh, he stood up and walked to the mailbox. Pulling out the letter, he saw the neat handwriting that had become so familiar over the last few months. It was from Clara West, the woman he had written to through the mail-order bride service. He had decided to try it, to give the idea of marriage one more chance. It was a practical decision. His ranch was thriving, but a single man could only do so much. He needed a partner, someone who could share the burden of the work and the quiet life that he had carved out for himself. He didn't expect love, not really, but he hoped for companionship. That was all. The letter was short but kind. Clara spoke of her life back in the city, how she had worked as a school teacher and longed for something more. She was ready to leave the noise and distractions behind for a quieter life, a life with a man who lived far from the troubles of the world. It was a life she dreamed of, one that would take her to the wide-open spaces where the stars filled the sky at night, and the only sound was the wind in the trees. Ben read the letter carefully, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He felt a strange mix of hope and fear. Was this really the woman he had been waiting for? Was she the one who could make his lonely life whole? He folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. The decision had been made. Clara would be arriving in Cactus Ridge in just a few weeks. Ben was ready, or at least he told himself he was. He couldn't afford to doubt it now. The train ride to Cactus Ridge would take her through the desert, the same stretch of land Ben had known all his life. He could only hope she would find it as beautiful as he did. As the days passed, Ben made preparations. He had never been one to worry about appearances, but this was different. He wanted to make a good impression. He mended the fences around the ranch, cleaned the house, and even bought a few new shirts. But his clothes were still plain, but he had to admit, the old ones were starting to show their age. He tried to imagine what Clara would be like. The letters had told him little about her looks, just enough to know she wasn't from the same world as him. She was from a big city, and she seemed to want a simpler life. It was strange to think that a woman from such a different place would want to settle in a town like Cactus Ridge. Ben had never met a woman like that before, and he wasn't sure what to expect. On the day of Clara's arrival, Ben made his way to the train station early. The heat of the desert sun was already beating down, but he didn't mind. His boots clicked against the wooden planks as he walked up to the platform. The train was due to arrive around noon, and he stood there, waiting, trying to calm his nerves. He didn't know what he had been expecting, but he certainly hadn't expected this. As the train pulled into the station, Ben noticed a woman stepping off the platform. She was tall, her hair long and dark, and she moved with a kind of grace that Ben couldn't quite explain. The way she walked was nothing like the women he had known in Cactus Ridge, who were sturdy and practical, with hands worn from hard work. This woman looked delicate, almost fragile, like she didn't belong in a place like this. Ben's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't realized how beautiful she would be. He stepped forward, his boots heavy against the dirt, and cleared his throat. "Clara West?" he asked, trying to sound calm. The woman turned to him, and for a moment they just stood there, staring at one another. Ben couldn't believe his eyes. She was even more stunning up close. Her eyes, a deep shade of green, seemed to see straight through him. Her skin was smooth and fair, and her smile, though small, held a warmth that made Ben feel both nervous and hopeful. "Yes, I'm Clara," she said softly, her voice light, almost musical. "You must be Ben." "I didn't expect." He trailed off, unsure of what to say. He had no words for the woman standing in front of him, no way to express the rush of feelings that hit him all at once. Clara's smile grew, though there was a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. "I know," she said. "I didn't expect this either." Ben could only nod again. There was no need for words. As they walked back toward his ranch, the distance between them seemed impossibly wide, and yet something about the way Clara held herself made Ben feel that perhaps this was the beginning of something far greater than he had ever imagined. The ride back to the dusty trail was awkward, at least for Ben. He had never been good with words, especially with women, and the woman sitting beside him on the wagon seemed like someone who belonged in a world far different from his own. She didn't look out of place in Cactus Ridge, but Ben couldn't help but wonder how she would adapt to life on a ranch. Clara, on the other hand, was just as nervous. She had left the bustling streets of the city behind, leaving everything she knew in search of a simpler, quieter life. She had spent so many years teaching school children, reading books, and dreaming of wide-open spaces that she thought she knew what to expect. But when the train pulled into Cactus Ridge and she saw the dusty town surrounded by endless desert, her heart had skipped a beat. This wasn't exactly the picture she had imagined. But then Ben had stepped forward to greet her. His tall, broad frame and the roughness of his clothes were a stark contrast to the fine suits of men she had known in the city. But there was something about him, his quiet strength, the way his hands seemed so steady despite the dust and heat, that made her feel both calm and curious. She had never met a man like Ben before. The silence between them was thick as the wagon rumbled over the dirt road. Clara's eyes occasionally darted to Ben, but he remained focused on the path ahead. She couldn't help but admire him. His face was weathered from years in the sun, his dark eyes steady and unwavering. He had the look of a man who was used to hard work, a man who didn't ask for anything but gave everything he had. Clara broke the silence first. "How far is it to the ranch?" Ben glanced at her for a moment, his hand still steady on the reins. "Not far now. About an hour. You'll get used to the ride. It's rough, but it's peaceful once you're out there." She nodded, trying to picture the place. She had read so much about the wild, untamed land of the West, but nothing prepared her for the vastness of it. The dry brush and rocky hills seemed to stretch on forever. There was no sign of the lush greenery she had imagined, no sparkling rivers or towering trees, just the endless desert and Ben's ranch somewhere in the distance. "I've never been out here before," Clara admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. Ben gave a small grunt. "Most folks haven't. Cactus Ridge ain't exactly a place folks visit on a whim." "I suppose not." The conversation drifted to quiet once again, the rhythmic sound of the wagon wheels the only noise between them. As they neared the ranch, Clara could see the outline of a modest cabin against the horizon. It was smaller than she expected, but sturdy, with a few cows grazing nearby and a couple of horses tethered to a post. The land around it was barren, dry, and harsh, yet there was something comforting about it. When they reached the ranch, Ben helped Clara down from the wagon, his hands brushing hers for a brief moment. She felt a warmth in the touch, though she quickly pulled her hand away, unsure if it was just her imagination. "Welcome to the dusty trail," Ben said, his voice low and steady. Clara looked around, taking in the view. The house was made of rough timber, the walls worn from the desert winds. The land was open, with a few scrub bushes dotting the dry earth. There were no fancy fences or manicured lawns, just wide open spaces as far as the eye could see. It was beautiful in its own way, but it was also stark and harsh. "It's beautiful," Clara said, though she wasn't entirely sure if she meant it. The beauty of it was different from the lush gardens and tall buildings she had known. But there was something about the silence of the land that called to her, something untamed and raw. Ben led her into the cabin where the smell of wood and earth filled the air. It was a simple home, with a small stone fireplace, a sturdy wooden table, and a few chairs. There was a large bed in the corner, a simple cot covered in a patchwork quilt. It was functional, but nothing like the refined comfort she had imagined when she dreamed of a new life. "I'll show you where you'll sleep," Ben said, his voice gruff as he pointed to the cot. "It's not much, but it's home." Clara nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. She had always imagined a life like this, something simple, something real. But now that she was here, she wasn't sure she was ready for it. Ben's eyes were watching her, though he tried not to make it obvious. He could see the uncertainty in Clara's face, the way she was scanning the room as if looking for something familiar. He knew this life wouldn't be easy for her. He had lived here for years, but Clara had spent most of her life in a world far different from this one. He wasn't sure if she would be able to handle it, but he didn't want to scare her off. "If you need anything," Ben said, breaking the silence, "just let me know. There's plenty to do around here, but you don't have to worry about it all at once." Clara smiled faintly, trying to ease the tension she felt. "I'll be fine," she said, though part of her wondered if she was truly ready for this life. Could she really leave the city behind and become part of this wild, unforgiving land? The days ahead would tell. Later that evening, Ben prepared a simple dinner, beans and bread, the kind of meal he had eaten countless times before. Clara sat at the small wooden table, her hands folded in her lap, watching him cook. She had always prided herself on her independence, but tonight she felt a sense of helplessness she hadn't expected. She wasn't used to being so far from everything she knew. When dinner was ready, Ben placed a plate in front of Clara and sat across from her. They ate in silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound between them. Ben didn't feel the need to fill the silence with words. He was used to the quiet, but Clara wasn't. She wanted to ask questions, to talk about her life in the city, to learn more about the man who had promised to be her husband. But the words caught in her throat. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet. "Ben, what made you decide to send for a bride?" Ben looked up at her, his expression unreadable. He hadn't expected that question, and for a moment he didn't know how to answer. He could lie, say it was just practical, that he needed help on the ranch. But that wasn't the whole truth. "I've been alone for a long time," he said slowly. "I thought it might be time to try something different." There was a quiet strength in him, something that made her feel safe and uncertain all at once. She wanted to believe that this would work, that they could build a life together here. But deep down, she wasn't sure. This land was too different, too wild for someone like her. For now, all she could do was wait and see if this life would be enough for both of them. The days passed slowly, each one marked by the rising sun and the work that seemed never-ending. Ben had been right about one thing. Life on the ranch was a lot of work. Clara had quickly learned that there was always something that needed to be done, whether it was mending fences, feeding the chickens, or sorting through the supplies in the small barn. At first the tasks felt overwhelming, but with each day Clara grew more confident. Ben, for his part, didn't make her feel out of place. He didn't expect her to know everything right away, and he never seemed impatient with her mistakes. He simply showed her how things were done, his hands steady and sure as he worked alongside her. His silence, which had once felt awkward, now felt like a quiet comfort. Clara appreciated the stillness between them. It gave her space to think and settle into her new life. Yet, despite the comfort Ben's presence provided, there was still a distance between them. They hadn't yet found a rhythm together, a flow that made the silence feel natural. Clara often found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, watching the way he moved with purpose, the way his eyes seemed to see things others might miss. He was a man of few words, but those few words carried weight. One evening, as they sat around the small table in the cabin, Clara finally decided to break the silence. "Ben, I've been thinking—" She paused, unsure of how to start. "About the future, I mean." Ben didn't look up from his plate, but he nodded slightly, signaling her to continue. "I came here because I thought it would be different," Clara said quietly, her voice trembling just a bit. "I thought I would be able to adjust, that I could become part of this life, but I'm not sure if I'm really cut out for it." Ben put his fork down and finally met her eyes. For a moment, Clara was caught in the intensity of his gaze. It was as if he could see right through her, like he understood exactly what she was feeling, even if she hadn't said the words aloud. "I don't expect you to love it right away," Ben said, his voice low but steady. "This land isn't for everyone. It's hard, and it's lonely. But if you can make a home here, it can be rewarding too." Clara nodded, but there was still doubt in her heart. She had grown up in a world full of crowds, where everything moved quickly and everything had its place. The quiet, unchanging landscape of the ranch was beautiful, but it was also isolating. The wind and the dust were constant reminders that the world here was harsh, and Clara wasn't sure if she could find her place in it. Over the next few days, Ben noticed the change in Clara. She was quieter than usual, often retreating to her small corner of the cabin after a long day's work. He tried to ignore it, to focus on the tasks at hand, but he couldn't help but worry. The woman who had arrived with hope in her eyes now seemed to carry an unspoken sadness. One morning as they worked together to gather firewood, Ben decided to speak up. "You've been distant," he said simply, his gaze fixed on the pile of wood in front of him. "If something's wrong, you can tell me." She didn't want to burden him with her doubts. Ben had already given her a chance, offered her a life here that was more than she ever expected. She didn't want to disappoint him, didn't want to admit to herself that she wasn't sure she belonged. "I don't know if I'm cut out for this kind of life, Ben," Clara finally confessed, her voice small. "I thought I could handle it, that I could fit in, but it's not the life I imagined. It's harder than I thought." Ben stopped what he was doing and turned to face her. There was no judgment in his eyes, just understanding. He knew the land wasn't easy, and he knew that Clara wasn't the kind of woman who could easily give up the comforts of the city. "I didn't expect this to be easy," Ben said, his voice calm. "I didn't expect you to come here and love it right away. It takes time, and it's okay to not be sure. I'm not asking you to change who you are." Clara looked up at him, surprised by his words. She had expected him to tell her to try harder, to push through her doubts. But instead, he was offering her the space to be herself, to figure things out at her own pace. "I didn't know what to expect either," Ben continued, his voice softer now. "I've spent my life alone out here. I thought I wanted it that way, but maybe I was wrong. Maybe it's time for something more." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to say that. Ben, the quiet cowboy who had seemed content with solitude, was telling her that he too was struggling with his own feelings. She didn't know what to say. She had thought of him as strong and independent, but now she saw a side of him that was more vulnerable than she had realized. "Ben," she said softly, her voice breaking through the silence, "I didn't come here just for the ranch. I came because I thought I could make a life with you. I just didn't realize how much of a change it would be." Ben met her eyes again, and for a moment neither of them spoke. There was an understanding between them, a silent agreement that they were both trying to navigate this new life together, even if they didn't have all the answers. "I'm glad you came," Ben said quietly. "I don't know what the future holds, but I'm willing to find out with you. We'll figure it out." Clara smiled, the tension in her chest easing a little. It wasn't going to be easy, but maybe that was okay. Maybe they didn't need all the answers right away. Maybe they could take it one day at a time and see where it led. As the days passed, things began to shift. Clara started to find small joys in the life she was building. She discovered that she liked the early mornings, the quiet time before the world woke up. She enjoyed the small tasks, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, mending clothes. She still missed the city at times, still longed for the comfort of familiar faces and bustling streets, but she was beginning to see the beauty of the land, the simplicity of the life she was building. And Ben, for his part, began to open up more. He wasn't the same quiet man he had been when Clara first arrived. He started to talk more, share more about his past, his thoughts, his hopes for the future. He still didn't say much, but Clara could see the change in him too. They were both adjusting, growing in ways they hadn't expected. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the desert, Clara turned to Ben, her voice steady. "I think I'm starting to find my place here," she said, her eyes soft with thought. "It's not perfect, but it's ours." "I'm glad," he said simply. "I think we're starting to figure this out." And with that, they sat in the fading light, side by side, both knowing that the road ahead might be difficult, but it was one they would walk together. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the desert as Ben and Clara sat together on the porch. The warmth of the day was fading, but the cool breeze that swept through the land felt like a gentle reminder of the beauty in the world. Clara rested her head on Ben's shoulder, and for a moment everything felt still, as if the world had paused to let them catch their breath. Ben had never imagined his life could be like this. He had spent so many years alone, surrounded only by the vast emptiness of the desert and the quiet hum of the cattle. But now, with Clara beside him, he realized that life had more to offer. The loneliness he had carried for so long was starting to fade, replaced by something new, a quiet connection, a shared understanding. Clara, too, was beginning to find peace in her new life. The ranch was no longer just a place of uncertainty. It had become her home, a place where she had come to love the simple rhythm of the days, the early mornings, the long hours spent tending to the land, the quiet moments she shared with Ben. All of it was starting to make sense. She still missed the city sometimes, the noise and the crowds, but she no longer felt out of place here. She had learned to appreciate the wide open spaces, the endless sky that stretched above them, and the silence that allowed her to hear her own thoughts. It had been a few months since Clara had arrived, and though there were still moments of doubt, she was no longer afraid. She had grown into this life, and Ben had become more than just a man she had married out of necessity. He had become her partner, not just in work but in life. They had started to find a rhythm together, working side by side, learning from one another, and building something that was theirs. One afternoon, as they worked together in the fields, Ben stopped for a moment, wiping the sweat from his brow. Clara was busy with the cattle, her hands steady and sure as she guided the herd to the new pasture. Ben watched her for a moment, admiring how far she had come. She had learned the ways of the land faster than he had expected, and her determination had earned his respect. He approached her, his boots crunching in the dry dirt. "You've gotten good at this," he said, his voice rough but warm. Clara looked up, surprised by the compliment. "I've had good teachers," she said with a smile. "You've been patient with me." Ben gave a small grunt. "It's not about patience, it's about learning." He paused for a moment before adding, "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Clara. You've made this place feel like a home." Clara's heart warmed at his words. She hadn't expected to hear something like that from him, not after the quiet distance he had kept when they first met, but over time she had come to understand him better. Ben didn't say much, but when he did, it mattered. She had learned to appreciate his quiet strength and his steady presence. He was a man who didn't need to say everything he felt because his actions spoke louder than words. They spent the rest of the afternoon working together, their movements becoming more synchronized with each passing day. The silence between them no longer felt awkward. It was a comfortable quiet, one that spoke of trust and understanding. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Ben suggested they take a break. They sat on the porch, watching the last light of day disappear behind the hills. Clara leaned back in her chair, her eyes closing for a moment as she enjoyed the peaceful stillness of the land. "I've been thinking," Clara said, breaking the silence. Ben raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "I think we should make this place more than just a ranch," she said slowly. "I think we should start expanding. Maybe build a barn for the animals, get a few more cows, maybe even try planting a garden." He had always focused on the basics, keeping the ranch running, making sure there was enough food and water for the cattle. He had never thought about expanding, about making the ranch more than just a means of survival. But Clara's idea intrigued him. She had a vision, something beyond just the day-to-day grind of ranch life. She saw potential where he saw only what was necessary. Ben had never thought of the ranch as anything more than a place to live, but Clara had shown him that it could be a home in the truest sense of the word. "I think that's a good idea," Ben said quietly. "We could use some more space, more help with the work. And a garden, well, that would be something new." Clara smiled, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I think it could be beautiful." "And we'd have fresh vegetables all year round?" Ben nodded slowly. "I never thought much about it, but you're right. It could be something worth working for." The conversation drifted into plans for the future. Talk of planting crops, building new structures, and maybe even inviting a few families to settle nearby. Ben had never imagined his life expanding beyond the ranch, but with Clara by his side, he began to see the possibility of a future that wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving, about building something lasting, something that would stand the test of time. As the days turned into weeks, Clara and Ben worked together to bring their vision to life. They built the barn, dug a well, and began to plant their first crops. The work was hard, but it was rewarding. Every time they saw the seeds they had planted begin to grow, every time they made a new improvement to the ranch, Clara felt a sense of pride. This was their home, and they were building it together. One evening, as they sat on the porch once again, watching the stars begin to appear in the night sky, Clara leaned against Ben, feeling the warmth of his body next to hers. The quiet was comfortable, a steady presence that had become familiar. She couldn't imagine her life any other way. "I'm glad I came here," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben looked out at her, his eyes soft with affection. "I'm glad you did, too." Clara smiled, feeling the weight of the past few months settle into something beautiful. The future was still uncertain, and there was still much work to be done, but for the first time, she felt like she belonged. The land, the ranch, and most importantly, Ben, they were all a part of her now, and together they would continue to build the life they had dreamed of, one step at a time. As the night grew colder, Clara rested her head on Ben's shoulder, the stars above shining brightly in the vast, open sky. The desert around them was silent, but for the first time in a long time, the silence felt like home.